lecture. So if you'd like to ask anything, please do type it into the Q&A section. You'll find the button at the bottom of the screen. So just press that and type in any question at any time. And then I will be asking the questions of our speaker at the end of the lecture. So talking of our speaker, I'm delighted to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Gareth Brereton. He's the curator for ancient Mesopotamia in the Department of the Middle East at the British Museum. Gareth is a specialist in the funerary archaeology and material culture of early Mesopotamia, having been awarded a PhD in archaeology at the Institute of Archaeology, University College London. He was the lead curator for one of the most magnificent exhibitions, I think, that the British Museum has put on. I am Ashurbanipal, King of the World, King of Assyria, which was held at the British Museum in late 2018 to 2019. It really overturned the conventional wisdom, I think, in museums that the ancient Near East could be a blockbuster. And so as a fellow museum curator, I was especially thrilled and delighted by what he achieved. Gareth has worked as an archaeologist in Iraq, Turkey, and Oman. And he is speaking this evening, however, in his capacity as a council member and trustee for the British Institute for the Study of Iraq. So thank you very much, Gareth, for agreeing to give this talk this evening. And I very much look forward to hearing you talking about Assyria and the West, archaeologists, diplomats, and adventurers in 19th century Mosul. Over to you.
Thank you, Paul. So good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It will be my very first webinar. It's all very strange me talking to everyone and I can't see you. And I greet you all from a very damp and quite cold South Wales, which sadly is currently under lockdown. So as Paul mentioned, my name is Dr. Gareth Brereton, and I'm an archaeologist and curator currently responsible for the Mesopotamian collections at the British Museum. And this evening, I'll be talking to you about the pioneering 19th century excavations in the Mosul region of Iraq and the subsequent rediscovery of Assyrian civilization. To kick off, to give you some context of what Assyria is before talking about its discovery, I will give you a very brief history of the rise and fall of the Assyrian Empire across 10 slides or so, so bear with me, please. Okay, where is Assyria? The heartland of Assyria was located in the northern region of present-day Iraq. During the 7th century BC, the empire was at its height, stretching from the shores of the eastern Mediterranean to the mountains of western Iran. It was the largest empire of its day. The history of the ancient Near East was shaped by the recovery and expansion of Assyria. By the 14th century BC, the relatively small kingdom of Assyria had grown into a large territorial power. This was a time of unprecedented political and cultural interaction throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, an international age sustained by the flow of goods, people, and ideas across long-distance networks of exchange. During the widespread social upheavals of the 12th century BC, the great states and empires of the late Bronze Age endured episodes of territorial contraction, political fragmentation, and collapse. During this period of region-wide collapse, Assyria ceded much of its territory to an influx of Aramaean communities, who carved out minor dynasties across northern Syria and expanded eastwards towards the Assyrian heartland. So at this time, this loss of power confined the Assyrian state to the plains east of the river Tigris in what is now the northeastern region of Iraq. Towards the end of the 10th century BC, Assyria gradually recovered and began to reassert its dominance in the region. Having re-established Assyria's former borders, the rulers of the 9th century initiated a new phase of imperial expansion. By campaigning further afield into neighboring territories, a series of devastating military campaigns into the lands north and east of the empire set in motion a steady flow of tributary gifts in the form of luxury goods, livestock, and human labor. Newly conquered states, while independent, were ruled under the yoke of Ashur, that is, as client kingdoms, where local monarchs were allowed to maintain their rule and system of governance. In the 8th century BC, following a prolonged period of internal revolt, the throne was captured by one of the royal princes, who introduced a series of reforms that limited the power of local officials and rival claimants to the throne. Looking to restore Assyria's waning political influence, the king embarked on a succession of aggressive military campaigns and revised Assyria's policy of establishing client kingdoms in conquered lands. So client rulers at this time were now replaced by Assyrian governors, and taxes were paid directly to the state. And this marks the beginning of Assyria's imperial age. Throughout the late 8th and 7th century BC, Assyria was ruled by the Sargonid dynasty, established by Sargon II. Sargon's hard-fought rise to power incited a wave of resistance against Assyrian imperialism in Babylonia and in the Western Client kingdoms, who sought to capitalize on Assyria's political instability. On defeating this Western alliance, Sargon consolidated control over the region by transforming distant kingdoms into a block of provinces ruled directly by Assyrian governors. As a result, Assyria now shared its borders with a number of powerful states: Egypt to the west, Elam to the south, and the powerful kingdom of Urartu to the north. Any resistance to Assyrian rule was met with severe military retaliation by Sargon's successor, Sennacherib, who rebuilt Nineveh as his capital and infamously sacked the city of Babylon. Sennacherib's successor, Esarhaddon, campaigned further afield than any other Assyrian king before him, his crowning achievement being the conquest of Egypt. Esarhaddon died whilst on campaign to consolidate further control over Egypt, a task that was left to his son Ashurbanipal to complete. When Ashurbanipal came to power in the 7th century BC, he was arguably the most powerful person on the planet. He inherited a vast domain that now stretched from the eastern Mediterranean basin in the west to the Zagros Mountains of Iran in the east. The Assyrian Empire was now at its peak. The Assyrian kings built on a lavish scale. Nineveh, for example, was transformed by Ashurbanipal's grandfather, Sennacherib, into a city the size and splendor of which astonished the ancient Near Eastern world. Sennacherib describes how he rebuilt the city of Nineveh over several years, using forced labor from conquered lands. He erected a great wall around the city and built himself a massive royal residence decorated with luxurious materials. Aqueducts and canals brought water from Nineveh's extensive gardens, and the city walls with its massive gates surrounded a vast metropolis some 7 square kilometers in extent. At this time, Nineveh was probably the largest city of its day, with a population of at least 100,000 people. Art and architecture flourished under the Assyrian kings, and if you were here for last month's lecture, Dr. Eva Miller would have discussed the art and architecture of ancient Assyria in some detail, so I won't do that here. But just to say that the Assyrian rulers built a succession of lavish palaces in their capitals, the interior rooms of which were lined with exquisitely carved stone panels depicting supernatural beings, military campaigns, and the royal hunt. But it was all not to last. Despite the wealth of information that we have about Assyria's last great ruler, King Ashurbanipal, his death remains a bit of a mystery. What we do know is that following his death or abdication around 631 BC, is that the empire started to rapidly fall apart. His 2 sons fought against each other for the throne, and in 626 BC, a rebellious general called Nabopolassar seized the throne in an attempt to free Babylonia from its Assyrian oppressors. The civil war was long and bloody, but the Babylonians gradually gained the upper hand and advanced into Assyria. The Iranian Medes joined the assault and sacked the venerable Assyrian city of Ashur. The temple belonging to Assyria's supreme deity was left in ruins, and the tombs of the Assyrian kings looted and destroyed. The empire's fate was sealed when the Babylonians and the Medes formed an alliance, and they both converged upon Nineveh, which fell after a heavy siege in around 612 BC. So the greatest city in existence was reduced to rubble. The temples and palaces were looted and set ablaze, and the images of the Assyrian kings were defaced in an act of vengeance. And that was the end of the Assyrian Empire. fall of Assyria was an iconic event that was recorded in passages of the Bible and also in the literature of ancient Greece and Rome. And this ensured that Assyria's great cities and legendary kings were never forgotten. These sources describe how Assyria was punished for the moral depravity of its rulers, who surround themselves with great riches and luxury. According to the classical sources, Assyria's last king was so debauched that he caused the empire's complete destruction. The biblical and classical accounts attracted travelers to the Mosul region from the Middle Ages onwards, who returned with tales of buried cities and ancient ruins. This negative image of Assyria was finally challenged by the archaeological discoveries made in the mid-19th century, which established Assyria as one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world. Systematic exploration of these ancient sites became possible through the expansion of British and French empires into the Middle East following the Napoleonic War, when the region was part of the Ottoman Empire. Among the earlier travels to Mosul was Claudius James Rich, a British resident in Baghdad. A child prodigy, Rich's interest in Middle Eastern languages began at the age of 9 when he was presented with some Arabic manuscripts. By the time he was accepted as a cadet officer in the East India Company, at 17 years of age, he had attained considerable knowledge of Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Syriac, Hebrew, and Mandarin. So impressed with Rich's linguistic ability, the directors of the East India Company converted his cadetship into a writership. He was posted to Turkey, Iraq, Egypt, and India. Despite his youth, he was appointed to the post of resident at the court of the Pasha of Baghdad in 1808, where he proved to be an outstanding diplomat. His interest in countries where he was stationed far exceeded his official requirements. As British resident in Baghdad, Rich could travel openly to areas that few or no other Europeans had previously visited. And all through this time, he kept detailed records of his travels and also produced accurate maps of the places he visited, including Babylon and Assyria. It can be argued that Rich was a pioneer of Mesopotamian archaeology. He started work at Babylon, the location of which was still disputed, visited and mapped the ruins of Nineveh, and even discovered the remains of the Assyrian city of Nimrud. At Nineveh, Rich prepared the first proper map of the city walls, heard stories about the presence of sculptures, and even found a few small fragments. At the mound of Koyunjik, which is the former citadel of Nineveh, Rich found what he described as a piece of fine brick or pottery covered with exceedingly small and beautiful cuneiform writing. This was one of the first pieces of the thousands of cuneiform tablets that would later be discovered at the site of Nineveh. Throughout his travels and adventures, Rich was an avid collector of antiquities, coins, and manuscripts. In addition to the manuscripts, Rich had assembled a small collection of antiquities from his travels in Iraq, which was sold to the British Museum by his widow. And these antiquities were the first ever Mesopotamian objects to be displayed at the British Museum. In 1820, Rich was offered a post as member of council under the Bombay government and left Baghdad for Shiraz in 1821. There, at only 35 years of age, he was struck down with cholera while helping victims of the epidemic, which had decimated the population. Rich's account of Nineveh was not published until 1836, when it then attracted the attention of the French government, who decided to install a new French consul in Mosul called Paul-Émile Botta. And of course, Botta was encouraged to look for antiquities. Botta was born in Turin in 1802 and was the son of a medical doctor called Paul-Émile Botta, who went on to become a prominent historian. His father retained French citizenship and worked as a doctor in Napoleon's army before settling in Paris. This is where Paul-Émile Botta, following in his father's footsteps, studied medicine. Prior to completing his medical studies, though, Botta joined the crew of a scientific expedition as a ship's doctor. Botta was a naturalist, and the journey took him to the Americas, where he collected botanical and zoological specimens. From the Americas, Botta sailed across the Pacific via the Sandwich Islands to China, where he picked up an opium habit, and from there back to France. Botta finally graduated in medicine and went in search of further adventure, becoming a military doctor in Egypt. In Cairo, Botta played host to the future statesman and twice Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, who was then a young dandy who had just published his first novel, Vivian Grey. They spent long nights conversing, and it is clear that Botta left a lasting impression on Disraeli. For Disraeli wrote the following in his diary: "I have not learned much through conversation with men, but the man from whom I have learned most through conversation is Botta, son of the Italian historian who I knew in Egypt, where he travelled as a doctor in Syrian dress. The most philosophical intellect with which I have ever come into contact." Back in Paris, Botta was appointed travelling naturalist by the museum in return for the specimens that he donated, and was sent on an expedition to the Red Sea. After his return to Paris again, he secured a position on the consular corps and was appointed consul at Mosul in 1841. Inspired by Richard's previous discoveries, this new position was created with the intention of exploring the remains of Nineveh and to acquire antiquities for the Louvre. So Botta set out to work at the mound of Koyunjik at Nineveh, where he excavated for 3 fruitless months. With no previous experience, Botta struggled to excavate the vast mound, which was formed from multiple superimposed settlements that spanned some 7,000 years. As such, the Assyrian remains were buried deep below later settlement layers, which had been badly disturbed by ploughing and other activities. Having no luck there, under the advice of a passing farmer, who talked to him of sculptures being found in a nearby mound, a frustrated Botta moved his team to Khorsabad, a few miles away, where his fortunes rapidly changed. There, in 1843, his workmen discovered the remains of an enormous palace complex built by the Assyrian king Sargon II. Botta had discovered the ancient Assyrian city of Dur-Sharrukin, commonly referred to as Khorsabad, after the nearby village. The walls of the palace were lined with magnificent gypsum alabaster slabs, which were carved in low relief. The workmen simply followed these reliefs and walls to get a plan of the entire building. Botta's preliminary finds were published in the journal Asiatique, and they constituted the first descriptions and drawings of a lost civilization, which naturally caused a sensation. The artist Van Dam joined Botta in 1844, where he produced incredibly detailed drawings of the palace and its fine sculptures. So this was the first time that people had seen the splendor of Assyrian civilization since its fall. Botta spent most of his time at Mosul fulfilling his duties as consul, and much of the excavation was left to his workers. Nevertheless, his spectacular finds secured funding and support from the French authorities. And more importantly, a permit to continue the excavations was obtained from the Ottoman government in Constantinople. This permit was essential since the Pasha of Mosul and the local population was very much opposed to Botta's work. They were very suspicious of Botta's true intentions, thinking that he was either hunting for gold amongst the ruins or seeking some form of evidence that might prove European claims to the land. Botta decided to terminate the excavations in 1844 and arranged to have some of the sculptures shipped back to Paris. They were placed on gigantic carts and dragged over 25 kilometers to Mosul, before being placed on rafts, held up by hundreds of inflated sheepskins, and floated down to the port city of Basra. From there, the sculptures were loaded onto boats headed to Paris, where they arrived in 1847. And with only a few months' time, they were displayed to the public at the Louvre. Arguably the most famous of the pioneering archaeologists to have excavated in Iraq was Austen Henry Layard. Layard spent much of his formative years living in Florence in Italy. His family settled just outside Florence, where the young Layard enjoyed a cultured existence, entertaining visiting poets, painters, and writers, and it's there he developed a passion for Italian Renaissance art. At the age of 12, Layard was sent to England to live with his conservative uncle and aunt, who believed that the children should benefit from a proper English education. In 1834, at the age of 17, he entered his uncle's solicitor's firm in London, but he was clearly not cut out for this line of work, and relations with him and his uncle deteriorated. Layard was far more interested in the literary men whom he met at his aunt's salon in Montague Place, which is now just behind the British Museum. One of which was the aforementioned Benjamin Disraeli, the acquaintance of Potter. Disraeli had a close relationship with Layard's aunt, Sarah Austen, who edited Disraeli's first novel. And Disraeli sent the family regular letters during his travels across the Middle East, which no doubt influenced the young Layard, who was desperate to escape London for a life of adventure. Having completed his apprenticeship at the firm, a paternal uncle living in Ceylon suggested that he emigrate there to practice law. Happy with the idea, Layard was introduced to the 32-year-old Edward Mitford, who was planning to go to Ceylon to set up a coffee plantation. But Mitford had a fear of the sea, so the two young men decided to travel to Ceylon overland via the Middle East. The pair left England in July 1839. Both Layard and Mitford travelled through the Balkans before reaching Constantinople, and proceeded across the Anatolian plateau down to Syria, Palestine, and Jordan, visiting Jerusalem and the ruins of Petra, where Layard was robbed and nearly killed. From Aleppo, the pair travelled to Mosul, where they stayed for 2 weeks and visited the Assyrian remains of Nineveh, Nimrud, and Ashur, as well as the ruins of Hatra, the Parthian caravan city. From Mosul, the two men hired a raft to sail south to Baghdad via the Tigris River, where they stayed for a few months, often going out on excursions to visit nearby archaeological mounds. But the next leg of their journey was to be through Persia. I mean, at the time, political relations between Britain and Persia were strained, so the two travellers decided to exchange their European clothes for local dress in the hope of blending in. And they actually joined a caravan of 70 Shiite pilgrims on their way back from Kabbalah. The day after arriving in Kermanshah, they visited the famous rock reliefs of Behistun, the Rosetta Stone of Persia. At this point, Layard and Mitford were forced to seek permission from the Persian authorities to travel through the country. After some wait, eventually they were permitted to travel by the northern route via Herat, and from there through Afghanistan and India. Layard, however, was desperate to travel through the southern route and stubbornly refused to proceed. The two companions could not reach an agreement, and Mitford proceeded alone and finally made it to Ceylon. Layard, however, hoping to gain permission to travel through the southern route by next spring, decided to stay, and he explored the Bakhtiari mountains of the southern Zagros. We've now seen that Layard, by this point, was captivated by his travels in the Middle East and was rapidly losing interest in Ceylon and a sensible career in law. And he had some adventures. After saving the son of a Bakhtiari chief from a fever, the 23-year-old Layard was welcomed into the family as a guest and spent his time exploring nearby ruins, hunting boars and lions, and going on expeditions into the mountains. During his stay with the Bakhtiari, Layard became embroiled in a conflict between the Bakhtiari chief and the local governor, participated in a raid on a Persian army camp, was briefly imprisoned before escaping, and was finally put under house arrest for a month before fleeing to Basra. After spending 3 days in Basra, Layard rode north to Baghdad with an English post rider, but they were robbed of their horses and most of their clothes, including their shoes. The pair continued barefoot in the blazing heat of the desert before being robbed again of the last pieces of clothing and human rags in exchange. Layard finally made it to Baghdad before sunrise, but found that the gates of the city had closed, so he settled down to sleep. As the gates were opened in the morning, a delegation of Europeans made their way out of the city, and Layard recognized and called out to an acquaintance, the English doctor Ross, who barely recognized the disheveled Layard. So Layard was now 25 years of age, and he'd given up the idea of going to Ceylon. His only option now seemed to be a return to England. However, Layard always seems to land on his feet, and he was soon presented with an enticing opportunity to remain in the region which he so loved. A conflict had arisen between the Persian and the Ottoman government over the southern Mesopotamian border. And Layard's knowledge of the local Persian politics was of interest to the British. He was told to report to the British ambassador in Constantinople, Stratford Canning, where he would become the ambassador's unofficial assistant. Layard set off from Baghdad, stopping in Mosul on the way, where he first encountered the newly appointed French consul, Botta. Dressed as a Bakhtiari, Layard was introduced to the 42-year-old Botta and revisited the mounds of Nineveh in the French consul's company, where he learned of Botta's excavation plans. And this is what sparked the beginning of a great friendship between the two men. Encouraged by the new resident in Baghdad, Henry Rawlinson, who would later help decipher the cuneiform writing system, Layard convinced the ambassador Canning to privately fund excavations of the Assyrian ruins of Nimrud for a period of 2 months. So Layard was to become an archaeologist of sorts. On his first day at the mound, Layard and his workmen scanned the surface until they found a fragment of alabaster that could not be moved. Layard ordered his men to start excavating around the slab, and several others started to emerge, forming a rectangle with a small gap. Layard then realized that he was standing above a room with a door. He had discovered the room of a palace. He was initially disappointed to find that the slabs were not carved in the fantastic low reliefs like those found in Khorsabad, though they were engraved with cuneiform inscriptions. Layard then moved to another section of the mound, where he yet again discovered another palace, all in one day. Finally, in November 1845, after a further 9 days of excavation, Layard finally discovered slabs with carved reliefs showing a battle scene that they were too fragile to remove. Layard now encountered a problem with the Pasha at Mosul, who withdrew Layard's permission to excavate at the site. Layard desperately wrote to the British ambassador Canning to apply for a permit from the Ottoman authorities that would not only allow him to continue the excavations, but also remove some of the sculptures back to Britain. In the meantime, a new Pasha was installed at Mosul who took a positive interest in Layard's work, but warned him that the Qadi, the religious leader in Mosul, was orchestrating a campaign against his excavations. As such, Layard decided to take a short break in the hope that the permit from Constantinople would be granted. And it was. Excavations then resumed on a smaller scale, and Layard's workmen immediately found more carved reliefs, and to the excitement of all, the head of a colossal winged lion. On discovering the head, the workmen proclaimed that they'd found Nimrod himself, a mighty hunter known from biblical accounts. This news, of course, soon spread to Mosul, and the Pasha commanded that all work at the site should be stopped at once. So Layard had to close these excavations until the permit properly arrived. But at this point, he was also desperate for more funds. Eventually, Canning, the British ambassador, persuaded the British government via the British Museum to take responsibility for the excavations, and Layard became the museum's agent. With the meagre funds provided by the British Museum, Layard decided that the best strategy was to simply follow the walls where the reliefs were found, which were considered to him to be the most important finds. However, his work at the Northwest Palace, which was built by King Ashurnasirpal as his royal residence, revealed immense treasures in the form of well-preserved reliefs, colossal sculptures in the form of winged bulls and lions, bronzes, carved ivory panels, and vessels of alabaster and glass. His excavations were a success. Arrangements were then made with the Ottoman government to have a selection of sculptures and objects shipped to Britain. Considering the size of the sculptures, this proved to be some task. Firstly, they had to be removed and transported on carts to the river Tigris, where they were loaded on barges that sailed down to the city of Basra in southern Iraq. From here, They were placed on a steamship and taken to Bombay in India, from which point they sailed around Africa and eventually to a small town in southeast England. They were finally transported to and then dragged up the steps of the British Museum in London. At this time, the British Museum was still under construction, and no one had anticipated the discovery of so many Assyrian reliefs, not to mention the space needed for their display. Fortunately, the reliefs found temporary accommodation in a room devoted to assorted antiquities. The publication of Layard's immensely popular account of his adventures in Syria and the arrival of more sculptors from Iraq compelled the museum to find a permanent gallery for the sculptures in 1854, where they were squeezed between the Egyptian and Greek sculpture galleries. For many 19th century art historians, the Assyrian sculptures were seen as a developmental link between the artistic traditions of ancient Egypt and Greece. So the Assyrian sculptures largely remain today where they were first installed over 160 years ago. Layard eventually left Nimrud and moved his workforce to the main mound of Nineveh in April 1847. He eventually located the famous Southwest Palace, which had been built around 700 BC by the Assyrian king Sennacherib. As at Nimrud and Khorsabad, the walls had been lined with carved stone panels glorifying the king's rule and achievements. Again, Layard dispatched his best discoveries by raft and shipped to Europe, though they sometimes took years to arrive. In 1849, Layard returned to Nineveh and continued to excavate the Southwest Palace, exposing some 2 miles of carved reliefs. During the sack of the great city in 612 BC, in antiquity, the palace had been burnt to the ground, and only a small proportion of the alabaster panels were well preserved. They were very badly fire damaged. Despite this, Layard and his assistants, notably the artist Frederick Cooper, were able to accurately draw hundreds of well-preserved panels in situ. And we still have these original drawings today held at the British Museum. Layard left Nineveh for the last time in 1851 for what would become a distinguished career in politics. When the British Museum obtained government funding to continue investigations at Nineveh, they were entrusted to Hormuzd Rassam, Layard's former assistant. Rassam was born in Mosul in 1826. His family were Chaldean Christians who worked in the muslin industry, to which Mosul gives its name. The first Protestant missionaries appeared in Mosul when Rassam was still a boy, and the sister of one of these missionaries married his elder brother, Christian Rassam, who would become the British vice consul in Mosul. In 1846, at the age of 20, Rassam became Layard's secretary and accountant during the excavations at Nimrud. The logistical scale of the excavations was immense, and it was Rassam who ensured their smooth run. He was the man behind the scenes doing all the work. When Layard swapped archaeology for politics, it was Henry Rawlinson, former resident of Baghdad, who took responsibility for the British excavations in Assyria. While Rawlinson was instrumental in the decipherment of the cuneiform script, he did not know how to run an excavation. As such, in 1852, the British Museum appointed Rassam as Rawlinson's agent, where he was to continue the excavations for 18 months. Rassam was frustrated that the area of the mound that he thought most promising had been allocated to the French, who now maintained that the mound was French property. On a number of occasions, Rassam's workmen came to blows with those working for the new French consul, Victor Mass. So there was a big rivalry between the two men. In the end, Rawlinson had come to an agreement with Glass that the northern part of the mound was reserved for the French, which Rassam disagreed with. Since the French team made no attempt to dig in the northern part of the mound, Rassam secretly sent his workmen to excavate the area during the night. Very sneaky. On the third night, his workmen discovered the room of the palace built by the last great Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, which was lined with well-preserved wall panels that showed the king hunting lions. In Rassam's own words, it was an established rule that whenever one discovered a new palace, no one else could meddle with it, and thus in my position as agent of the British Museum, I had secured it for England. Rassam was instructed by Rawlinson to dispatch whatever seemed unique or interesting back to London. However, the British Museum was running out of space, and its trustees could not quite agree on the historic or artistic value of the sculptures, or how they should be best displayed. The final sculptures to arrive at the museum, including many from the North Palace, were eventually displayed at a lower level in what came to be known as the Assyrian basement. You can see some pictures here on screen of it before it was converted in the 1960s. And sadly now it remains a storage room. Faced with these constraints and limited funds, the museum authorities instructed Rawlinson to limit the number of sculptures sent to London. By way of contrast, the French government generously funded the shipment of sculptures, and Rawlinson knew that there was a substantial French vessel due to arrive in Basra to collect material from the French excavations, which was headed for the Louvre. And Rawlinson made a deal with the French authorities. If they were willing to transport the remaining sculptures from the North Palace to London, they could take whatever else they wanted from the sites excavated by the British. And the French agreed. However, in an unfortunate turn of events, the raft carrying the French shipment down to the Tigris was attacked. Over 30 wall panels, about 3/4 of the French share from the North Palace, together with much else, was sadly lost to the river and never recovered. The 19th century excavations at Khorsabad, Nimrud, and Nineveh caused a media sensation and captured the public imagination. In Britain, public enthusiasm for Assyria was fueled by the release of Layard's best-selling book, Nineveh and Its Remains, and by the display of the sculptures in the new gallery at the British Museum, which opened in 1847. Layard also advised on replicas of the Assyrian sculptures, which were to be displayed as part of the Nineveh court in the great exhibition held at Crystal Palace. The spread of Assyrian visual imagery was to have a major impact on painting and applied arts in the UK and beyond during the second half of the 19th century, which led to a brief phase of Assyrian revival. Rassam left Nineveh in 1854 when his funding expired, yet the excavation continued in the organisation known as the Assyrian Excavation Fund, which had been set up to ensure that excavations would continue should the British Museum abandon them. The fund appointed Henry Rawlinson, who was still an agent for the British Museum, to oversee the project. Rawlinson decided to hire an experienced excavator called William Loftus to continue the excavation of Ashurbanipal's North Palace at Nineveh. Meanwhile, the British Museum agreed to provide further funds, so Rawlinson employed Christian Rassam, Hormuzd Rassam's brother, to excavate the same palace. So we had a situation that by August 1854, there were two competing British teams at Nineveh, funded by two separate organisations, both under the direction of Rawlinson. The two excavators, Rassam and Loftus, were not on friendly terms and developed an intense rivalry. So much so that Christian Rassam had workmen guarding his area of the mound at all times from Loftus. However, with the resumption of British Museum funding, Loftus was transferred to the museum employment, and he eventually became director of the excavations until their closure. Not all of the sculptures were removed by the French and the British during the 19th century. Many were left behind and safely reburied, while other sculptures were moved, either complete or in fragments, by various people who visited the sites, so that they are now scattered all around the world. The scholarly legacy of these early excavations in northern Iraq are enormous, having provided both the practical and the intellectual bedrock of Assyrian archaeology and Assyriology. Today, over 150 years later, this seminal period of discovery remains the foundation and focus of much current research. Archaeologists from Iraq and across the globe continue to build on these pioneering archaeological discoveries of the 19th century. However, between the Gulf War and the invasion and occupation of Iraq, Iraq's cultural heritage has suffered from sanctions, looting, and vandalism. More recently, Daesh deliberately and systematically destroyed cultural heritage in Iraq and neighboring Syria on an unprecedented scale, including much of the ancient sites of Nimrud and Nineveh. This cultural heritage is of immense importance to the people of Iraq and to our shared understanding of human history. And a number of organizations worldwide, including the British Museum and of course the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, are working closely with the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and Heritage to help rebuild, research, and promote Iraq's rich cultural heritage for present and future generations. And that is the end of my lecture. I hope it provided a fairly honest and brief overview of the circumstances of exploration into Assyria and removal of sculptures back to Europe in the 19th century. And I'm more than happy to take any questions if you have time.
Thank you very much indeed. That was a terrific survey and illuminating and engaging lecture. Thank you very much indeed. The floor is open. If anyone has any questions, they can write in the Q&A or else in the chat. I'm both available to me. So if anyone would like to add a question to those, please do so now. Otherwise, I think I'll begin, if I may, just by asking you a question around this story you've just told. Is there are there any plans to tell that story, even in a sort of small way, within the British Museum itself? So we've got that history again alongside the Assyrian reliefs themselves.
I think we have to, and it's fundamental to do so. And as part of the grand redisplay of the whole museum, we're going to be talking a lot more about object histories and the history of excavations, and the political context and circumstances surrounding how these excavations happened and how the objects came back to museum collections. And we've had the opportunity to do this a little bit with temporary exhibitions, but with the whole redisplay at the museum, we can properly engage with this.
Great, thank you. We have a question around, do you feel that there's a place for future excavations at these sites?
Oh, of course, yes. Excavation hasn't really stopped. Even through times of conflict, there's been Iraqi teams out there excavating these sites or doing conservation work or doing recording. So research very much continues to this day, and there's a lot more to learn from these sites.
Thank you. And a really interesting question around whether there were any efforts or attempts to keep at least some of the artifacts in Iraq during these excavations.
There was a point where the Ottoman government realized that it wanted to keep some of this heritage, and of course they established their museum, the date of which I can't quite remember off the top of my head, in Constantinople in response to these excavations. And then there was a concerted effort to keep some of these sculptures and artifacts within the Ottoman Empire. And also they created a very early antiquities law of sorts in the 19th century as well. But I'm not sure how well it was enforced. That came later in response to these early excavations.
And you told the story of the loss of some of these reliefs in the Tigris. Has there been any effort to recover those? And indeed, is the location of the loss actually known?
There's, to my knowledge, been no attempt to recover them. And of course, the sculptures were made out of a gypsum alabaster, which is water soluble. So I'd imagine that the reliefs themselves would be very badly damaged if they ever were discovered, and perhaps completely defaced from contact with water. But I do know a couple of scholars who have attempted to pinpoint the location of where this happened. And I believe also there was an occasion where I think the river exposed a portion of a human-headed winged bull. But I think that was perhaps from a broken raft in antiquity when they were taking these colossal sculptures back to the Assyrian cities, because of course we have reports that some of these sank in antiquity as well.
And a question here about visiting the British Museum and actually going on an Assyrian tour. And then a question really about having seen all the reliefs on display, what quantity of artifacts are actually in the basement or in the storage?
Oh, good. Good question. I did calculate this at one point. I think, if I remember correctly, that about 80% of our reliefs are on display. The remainder from Ashurbanipal's North Palace were originally on display in the Assyrian basement, which closed some 20 years ago, and sadly is not going to reopen. So in the last 5 years or so, we've been gradually taking the reliefs off display so they can go, or off the walls essentially, so they can go on tour, so they can be either put into special exhibitions or they can go out on loan where people can see them. So actually the majority of the reliefs have been out on tour now. Most recently at the Getty, which they're still on display, and again in Russia, in St. Petersburg at the Hermitage, they're on display.
And another important question here around documentation of all the items that came from the palace spread around the world. Has there been any attempt to do that?
There has, but it's an incredible puzzle, I believe. The problem is, at the time, archaeology wasn't really a discipline, it was in its infancy. And although excavation and recording techniques did gradually improve, there was not many records kept where these things went. So it's been quite a puzzle for archaeologists to piece the relief fragments back together. But there are publications out there which have attempted to do so. And more pieces keep cropping up. For example, just before the lockdown happened earlier this year, I had a public inquiry where someone had found a fragment of an Assyrian relief in a charity shop in southwest England, which he had purchased for very little money. And then he realized there was a label on the reverse, and on the label was a note from a certain William Boucher, who was an artist attached to the last expeditions at Nineveh, so under Loftus and Rassam, where he drew the reliefs and sculptures. So we have some of his original drawings in the British Museum. And he'd obviously taken this fragment, which the museum didn't want, perhaps, because it was a very small fragment of an Assyrian soldier, and gifted it to his friend, and then must have got lost over the years until it's been now rediscovered some 150 years later. So they do keep turning up as well.
And now we have a question coming all the way from Thailand. So wonderful to have people joining us from really across the globe. And the question is, based on how Layard actually chopped up bits of the cuneiform script off the palace reliefs, whether there was any particular archaeological blunders, as perhaps we would judge them today, that damaged the study of Assyriology during those early excavations?
There were certainly a lot of archaeological blunders, but whether or not that impacted massively on the decipherment and understanding of the cuneiform script and the Assyriology in general, I doubt. And after these excavations, really, this was the time where they were excavating these large sculptures and then bringing them back. And then after that, pretty much all museums wanted were tablets. And they sent their agents out and excavators out to get tablets and tablets and tablets so that they could decipher and understand Assyrian history, and that formed the basis of Assyriology. So I don't really think that the chopping up of reliefs really impacted too much.
And another question really about the loss of the reliefs in the river. And given that there's now sophisticated technology, I mean, you've already mentioned the fact that the reliefs might have dissolved away, but might it actually be possible to recover them?
I think it'd be worth trying. If someone has the money and the sense of adventure to go and try, then yeah, why not? Always worth trying, but I have a feeling they will be pretty much be unrecognizable now. Damaged, severely damaged.
And another question around the diaspora material, the idea of I guess a sort of database which will pull this all together, but has there been much research actually undertaken beyond the core collections on this material?
Yeah, I think there's plenty of Assyriologists and Assyrian archaeologists who do keep track of where these things end up. So you'll see them perhaps in auction catalogues or private collections you hear about, and people do note where they come from. And there have been attempts in the past, like I've mentioned, to collect this data in publications, or catalogues, if you will. But certainly there is an incentive now to do this digitally, perhaps. And I've known people who've tried to track reliefs from Nimrud, for example, that are scattered all around the world, and try and collect them into one place digitally. And I think that's probably the way forward now.
Thank you. And a question now which raises the missing perhaps part of these stories, and that's the female element. So someone who's been researching 20th century women writers like Freya Stark and Gertrude Bell, but have you come across the equivalent for the 19th century excavations?
Question. Not to my knowledge. But have you come across any, Paul?
Well, I think the only person that really had a significant role but never gets any credit is Mrs. Rich.
Of course, yeah, okay, that's a good point, actually, yes.
Yeah. So Mary Rich really was worked with her husband and had great antiquarian interest. So I guess if that's the foundations of the collection in the British Museum,
no, exactly.
She's there with him.
And she administered his estate after his death and made sure that they went to the right places.
So, but there's some research to be done there, I think.
No, I think so as well, certainly.
And then a question around the Iraqi government support for excavations, and do they support excavations with funds? And the question is, if yes, is it enough? And if no, why not?
I think they judge applications for excavation permits based on a number of points, not just funds. I think in terms of the contribution to archaeological knowledge is an important factor. Political consideration, safety, whether it's possible with the sort of team and the size of the team in terms of this, in relation to the size of the site. So I don't think they are generally very supportive, but of course they control access to these sites rightly, and they have to be strict about it. In the past, of course, some archaeological projects haven't been the best, let's say. But it's not so much to do with funding as to do with the suitability of the application to the project.
I think the question may have been more around the State Board of Antiquities and whether they fund excavations themselves, or whether they just allow.
No, they're very active in undertaking excavations as well, alongside international excavations and in collaboration with international excavations. But they very much are busy excavating.
Right. And a question here, do we think that all the sculptures, reliefs and artifacts actually made in situ or were transported from elsewhere? So were they made locally or brought into these Assyrian capitals?
A bit of both. So we know, for example, that the colossal human-headed winged bulls and lions were lightly carved in the rough, where they were taken out of the quarry and transported, then probably erected in place and then finished with detail while it was erect. And perhaps in some instances, the same for the Syrian reliefs, but generally they would, again, import perhaps from local quarries, cut them down to size, erect them in place, and then they'd have specialists working on them, probably in situ in the palaces in that case.
And now we move to more recent events and how much damage to sites like Nineveh during the recent conflicts.
I think the official estimate for Nineveh, if I remember rightly, was something like the 70 or 80% damage to standing archaeology. That, of course, is the standing archaeology. Being that Nineveh consists of a series of mounds, that conceals a lot more archaeology underneath. But in terms of standing archaeology, about 70 or 80% was damaged, as far as I remember.
A depressing number. And so in terms of the BM's plans, now for the cuneiform tablets, so obviously not your particular area of curation, but the question is that understood that the museum is working on translating them and making them public. So what are the plans for that?
So at the moment we're digitizing our collections, which takes time, money, a lot of time. And we have recently completed the collection commonly known as Ashurbanipal's library, so the collection of tablets from Ashurbanipal's palace. And they have now all been successfully photographed and uploaded, I think, to the relevant websites where they're freely available to see and access. And people work from the photos to help aid the translations as well.
Thank you. And I should just point out that that question was asked someone who has a family listening in from Norway, Washington, and Italy. So again, thank you very much for this global audience. It's very gratifying. A question now from someone who's visited the museum in Suleimania, where the most recent Gilgamesh tablet is held, and was actually able to see it, lucky person. Does the British Museum provide training of any kind to those sorts of museums on how to handle and store their findings? We are currently running a training program that's aimed more at archaeologists who work on site. So we take overall, I mean, 50 trainees from the State Board of Antiquities who are actually working archaeologists in Iraq. And they come over for 3 months in London, and then we go out with them for 3 months in the field as well. And we also have running separately to that something called the International Training Program, where we get museum professionals from all around the world, and they come to the British Museum, I think, for a period of, again, probably 3 months or so, and work on various aspects and projects, and anyone can apply for that as well. Though sometimes it's difficult getting participants from Iraq and neighboring countries due to visa issues and other situations like that. I've been to Suleimania Museum, and I think it's a fantastic museum with some amazing material. And then we've got a couple of comments rather than questions, but just I think reminding us, although we couldn't think of many women for the 19th century, that of course in the early 20th century we've got some incredible female names to consider in the story of excavation. Gertrude Bell, of course, for setting up the Iraq National Museum, and then Agatha Christie, the wife of Max Mallowan at Nimrud. So we should hold on to those names as well.
No, exactly. Unfortunately, the history of archaeology in the 19th century in the Middle East is pretty much privileged men with beards, I think.
And then a question which is very resonant and much being debated at the moment. Can we envisage a time when the artifacts could be returned to Iraq?
That is a good question, and it's one that's now hotly debated, of course. I have my own opinions about that. Maybe I'm not sure if I can express them as an employee of the British Museum, but we can advise as curators, but at the end of the day, sadly, we can't make the executive decisions on what should be done with these things. But I do hope that in the future, it would be nice to do some form of exchange with Iraq, where we most likely long-term loan objects to them for their museums for essentially a very long period of time. We'll do some sort of exchange like that. And a knowledge exchange as well to go with that, perhaps. But again, those are the powers that be. And that's not myself, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's important the conversations are happening.
Yes, definitely.
A question around the hanging gardens, I think this is, in Assyria. What is there some evidence for that?
I think the evidence put forward for that was a relief from Ashurbanipal's palace, which actually shows the gardens built by, presumably by Sennacherib, which has an aqueduct taking water from afar into the city to feed channels where there's orchards and all sorts growing. And above the aqueduct, there's a tree line, which some scholars have interpreted as perhaps evidence of sort of a step garden or a hanging garden. Personally, I think that's just a artistic convention within the relief itself. And there's also some textual evidence from the reign of Sennacherib as well, where he describes how he built the palace and the gardens and how he drew water from wells using this technological marvel, which some have interpreted as an Archimedes screw. But again, I think that's perhaps a little doubtful as well. I would certainly say that the gardens of Nineveh were spectacular and lush, and if anything, may have served as a template or inspiration for any later garden that might have occurred at Babylon.
Thank you. And then a question really about your own experiences as an archaeologist or a visitor to these sites. What are your impressions of Assyria?
I have not visited Assyria proper myself, so I've worked in Kurdistan, in Sulaymaniyah actually, in the valley there, and in southern Iraq just north of Basra, and two very different places in fact. But I've always had an incredible time working in the region, working with local archaeologists and the local population as well, who are often employed on these digs. And it's a magical place, and I can't wait to go back as soon as I can.
And we have another comment really, which is just a sort of plea for training for museums, and I think we're all keen in collaborating with our colleagues in Iraq, where they can train us as well. So
definitely, it's a two-way process.
A question around Iraqi scholarship today, and whether you know of any scholars in Iraq who have actually told the story of the European excavators. So, as it were, the story told from the Iraqi side. Mosul, for example, the question said, has a rich academic history. I don't know if
that's true. I mean, one of the principal figures of this time was Rassam, Hormuzd Rassam and his brother Christian. And of course, they were Iraqis from Mosul. And Hormuzd Rassam wrote a lot about his adventures and his travels throughout the region. But in terms of more recent Iraqi academics discussing that, I'm not sure I've come across anything. Have you, Paul?
Well, I know that Mosul University has what they describe as an Oriental department, which is really about the Orientalist in the Middle East. So, so yes, there are scholars in Mosul University. I'm afraid that their names escape me at the moment, but they are there. They are looking at that European contact with their part of the world. So yes, that's a really important and interesting development for sure.
What perspective that we need, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see, a few more questions coming in. What is now the most outstanding question we want to answer regarding history of Mesopotamia or Assyria?
I think from doing the Ashurbanipal exhibition, it's always bugged me that we don't know what happened to Ashurbanipal, what happened at the end of his reign, because I think it was so instrumental to the later fall of the empire itself. And I don't think we quite understand what happened there as well. So maybe more research made into the last days of Assyria, I think would be pretty interesting. How a civilization of that size that persisted for so long collapsed so suddenly.
And another question around the destruction of artifacts. You mentioned 70%, I think, of Nineveh perhaps being damaged as a result of recent conflicts. Do we know how many Assyrian artifacts may have been destroyed as a result of the US-led occupation of that?
That has been documented, I believe, by an Italian scholar. He's published a book on that. I think he was there just to document the release just before the American occupation. Again, it's difficult to know sometimes whether the damage was caused by looters, vandalism, or sometimes from occupied forces as well. But certainly at Babylon, I think it's better documented. Wouldn't you agree, Paul? Because the had a base at Babylon itself. And I think the damage to Babylon is well documented.
Yes, Babylon for sure has had good analysis, but there's so much work to do in just reconstructing recent history, I think, let alone the ancient world. So it's an ongoing work. Another question that takes us back, and you may have no more to say than in your previous answer, but this is around really the objects in the storage rooms of the British Museum and whether they might go back to Iraq at some time.
Well, I think the idea is that we want to put some of these objects on permanent display as part of the grand redisplay of the whole museum, which is in progress. But I think it's also important to have some objects in reserve so they can travel freely and be seen either if they go on tour or on special exhibitions and travel the world. But again, if it's a case where we're unable to do that, I think it would be nice to make an arrangement so that some of these objects might go back on a long-term loan basis or on an exchange basis or some sort of agreement on that.
Thank you. And then you'll be able to confirm where the BM it has had recent excavations in the region of Suleymania, is it Dukan Lake? Is that where John McGuinness is?
Yeah. Oh, John McGuinness, yes. Yeah. Yes, that's correct. A Parthian site.
Yes. And then the question that's affecting us all, of course, the COVID pandemic, how is that affecting research on the ground in Iraq? And how might things be adapted to do things online?
Good question. I'm not sure what the situation is for Iraqi archaeologists, but certainly for anyone outside of Iraq, it's impossible. Well, from Britain, it's impossible, certainly, to go out there and excavate or work at the moment. And we just don't know when research can continue. But as for whether Iraqi researchers are still working on sites and in country, I do not know, actually. I imagine they probably are continuing to some extent.
I mean, certainly, I can speak for some of the projects that the Institute is supporting, where Iraqi colleagues are able to go out, particularly in southern Iraq. The it still seems to be an opportunity, even though, of course, the country is being very heavily hit, as everywhere, by the pandemic. So I guess, as with everywhere, there are some places where it remains possible. And then we're reminded, reminded of some of the more contemporary approaches to thinking about ancient Assyria. We've got a comment here reminding us that this story is being told through the eyes of contemporary artists like Michael Rakowitz, of course. I think you've also worked with.
Yes, I've worked with Michael on a few projects. In the meantime, there's plenty researchers that can get on with. There's archival material, collections in storage, there's collections on display, there's new ways of interpreting collections. There's plenty to do with what is available, I think. So I don't think we're too worried about it yet.
And a very good point. We should remember here Lamia al-Gailani and her incredible contribution to the archaeology of Iraq. We mentioned earlier important female names that we talk about, and of course Lamia, a great friend of the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, and we miss her very much. So yes, thank you for reminding us to include her in this conversation. A question now, if you had an artifact, how might you go about getting it identified? So again, around...
So the British Museum, it does have an identification service as such, where you can contact the department in question to arrange to see a curator or to email photos of said object. But of course, we cannot look or give opinions about objects which have no provenance. And so we can only look at and give opinions on objects with what's termed good provenance, and abides by local and national laws in relation to antiquities.
And then a comparison question around the British Museum's collection of Assyrian reliefs. How does that compare to permanent collections in other countries?
I think the British Museum arguably has one of the strongest collections of Assyrian sculptures and other materials probably in the world. Other big collections being, of course, in the Louvre and in Berlin as well. And of course, Baghdad, they have a great collection. I actually think their display of reliefs are probably the best out there at the moment compared to other institutions.
I think one final comment here, and I'm glad to say it's from our colleague, Augusta McMahon, who's the editor of our journal Iraq. So wonderful to have you with us, Augusta. She wanted to remind colleagues and friends that there's an Iraqi-Italian project that's recently begun excavations actually at Nineveh, despite COVID-19. That's really interesting news. Just a couple more questions sneaking in here at the end. Could you tell us around the dating of objects? A big question, but maybe you could limit it perhaps just to the Assyrians.
Yeah, that's a complicated question, I would say. I guess in relation to Assyria, of course, we have the written documentation, which are very useful because they can usually contain a lot of dates. So if you can relate an archaeological object to the same context or strata as some of these inscriptions, whether they be on palace walls or maybe on tablets or pots or whatever, then that gives you a good idea to start with. Without supporting written documentation, there's of course techniques like carbon dating and so forth for some objects, which you can relate carbon dates from one context with an object. It could be quite a complicated answer if I go into it in any detail.
I think we probably saved an entire lecture to that one, so we'll add it to our list for later. And I think perhaps we'll just take one final question here. before we wrap up. And it is actually quite a big question, but I think it's sort of a rather nice one to end with, which is really around your thoughts, Gareth, around how a civilization like the Assyrians came to be so magnificent.
Oh, that's a big question indeed. I guess it depends on whether you do see them as magnificent or not. I think that civilization comes at a high price. Human suffering, forced labor, deportation, enslavement, that was all part of the process of civilization, unfortunately. So we might look at the beautiful objects and lovely reliefs and the magnificent cities, but that came at a great human cost. So I'm very suspicious or wary of questions about how magnificent civilization really is.
Well, thank you, Gareth, for that answer, and thank you for this incredible lecture and taking the time to answer these hugely interesting and interesting questions from our audience. Very grateful to you indeed for illuminating the world of 19th century Assyrian excavations. And thank you, everybody, for attending. And I look forward very much to you joining us for another BISI virtual lecture. And we'll be advertising the next one on our social media channels. But of course, the best way you can find out about all our activities and forthcoming lectures is by becoming a member of the British Institute. And so I'd invite those of you who haven't yet signed up to join us to visit our website at bisi.ac.uk, and there you can see the sorts of projects that we're engaged with, as well as the sorts of activities we've got planned for the future. But in the meantime, thank you very much, Gareth, and thank you all again for joining us this evening, and good night.